I stand before you today as an ally who can see right from wrong.
If we see the bullying, if we see the hate crimes, and we do not step up and stand up on behalf of our Jewish brothers and sisters, then we are as guilty as the people that are perpetrating the violence.
That's a montage of some recent examples of non-Jewish allies who've been coming forward to show their support for Canadian Jews and even for Israel in the face of skyrocketing anti-Semitism since October 7th of last year. You heard the voices of Rahil Raza, a Pakistani-Canadian Muslim journalist, and Dr. Phil McGraw, the American TV psychologist. He was the keynote speaker at a Spirit of Hope gala put on by the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal, where they hosted 8 non-Jewish allies, including Raza, plus Caroline Damore, General Rick Hillier, Indigenous Canadian Mr. Justice Harry Laforme, John Love, Victoria Mancinelli, Rocco Rossi, and Father Raymond D'Souza. Now, that gala came just ahead of a similar event, the Rally for Humanity, that was held in Vaughan, Ontario, organized by One Global Voice, where guests signed a proclamation of unity, which is being sent to the House of Commons and Toronto City Hall on Wednesday. More than 2,000 people have signed that proclamation. These initiatives have been led mainly by the Jewish community, but there's one new campaign underway conceived and carried out by one of the country's most high-profile Christian thinkers, Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett. He's a deacon in a Ukrainian Orthodox church in Ottawa. He works with the Cardis Christian think tank, and he's well-versed in issues that matter to Canada's Jews. He worked with the previous Prime Minister, Conservative leader Stephen Harper, even visiting Israel with the former PM, and then served for 3 years under Harper as Canada's first ever ambassador of religious freedom from 2013 to 2016. But when the Trudeau Liberals came to power, they cancelled that position and gave Bennett a new Jewish-adjacent job as head of the Canadian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Organization, or IHRA for short. Fast forward to October 7th last year, Bennett's been appalled at the Jew hatred aimed at his Jewish cousins, as he calls us, and he excoriates the 19.3 million Christians in the country who he feels are mainly keeping silent.
Christian leaders, clerical leaders, lay leaders have to come together and make a very clear statement, and the declaration is a theological declaration in large part, make a very clear statement about who we are as Christians and our relationship to the Jewish people.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Wednesday, November the 13th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation.
In Berlin, rumors are spreading.
Holocaust victims, their bodies are just dug up.
It's a shunda.
But the truth is even more unnerving.
Was your family in the Shoah?
Dude looks like he was in the Shoah.
As the world panics...
This is some ritual, bringing the dead back to life.
No, you said this wasn't illegal.
It isn't, I don't think.
One woman seeks the truth.
These are questions you can't answer.
And you're too afraid to even ask them.
Justice, a Holocaust zombie story. An original audio drama from the CJN in association with the Ashkenaz Foundation. Listen now at the cjn.ca/zombies or wherever you get your podcasts.
Just before the Jewish New Year, Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett launched his campaign to convince more of his Christian colleagues to take a public stand against the spiking anti-Semitism. Bennett composed his Canadian Christian Declaration Against Antisemitism, and he'd hoped a few hundred Christians would sign on by the time the petition closed on October 25th, purposely coinciding with the Jewish calendar date of the one-year anniversary of the 2023 Hamas massacre. But to Bennett's delight, well over 700 people have endorsed his initiative, including even some Catholic bishops, some Anglicans, some United Church folks, evangelicals, and even a couple of Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews have added their support. Now, Bennett's committed to put the declaration's words into action, with plans to hold a summit in the new year of Jewish and Christian leaders, followed by a year-long program that pairs individual congregations and schools of both faiths for in-person programming. On today's episode of the CJN Daily, Bennett joins me from Ottawa to explain why he believes Christians have an ancient moral and religious responsibility to protect their Jewish cousins.
Thanks very much, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's great to meet you as we try to discuss allyship as the Canadian Jewish community and Jews around the world. Many of, as you know, have been feeling vulnerable and alone. What motivated you to put this petition together to Christian leaders?
I guess there are two things. First of all, I'm very concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism in the country. And that's not just since October 7th. I mean, it's been rising for the last number of years. I was very concerned about that, generally speaking, just as a citizen. But then as a Christian, I was very concerned about the relatively tepid response from Christian leaders to that increase in anti-Semitism. And my background has been in religious freedom and conscience rights, certainly for the last decade or more. And when I served as Canada's ambassador for religious freedom, I was also the head of the Canadian delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So I have an acute awareness, I think, of the need to address these things when they rear their ugly head. And so I think the Jew hatred that we're seeing in our streets, on our campuses, is particularly repugnant, and we need to speak out, obviously. That's the first thing. But I also grew up in Midtown Toronto in the 1980s, 1990s, and I come from a sort of a waspy Catholic background. I went to private school.
What school did you go to?
I went to Royal St. George's College in the Annex in Toronto. Great school. But I grew up in that milieu, and that was the air that I breathed. And there was always just lurking in the background this kind of polite anti-Semitism. You just didn't have Jews as friends. And so that leads to the second really fundamental reason why I launched this declaration, is that, to quote a great Spanish saint of the 20th century, Saint Josemaria Escriva, who was the founder of Opus Dei, when speaking to a group of students at a university, a young woman stood up and said, Father Josemaria, I'm Jewish, and I would really appreciate hearing from you how you understand me. And how do you understand Jews as a Catholic and as a Catholic priest? And he answered in a very, I think, poignant way, where he said, the love of my life is a Jew, as is his mother. And so he spoke about Jesus Christ in that way. And so I would just echo St. Josemaria's words, the love of my life is a Jew. Mary, Virgin Mary, a Jew. All the 12 apostles were Jews. And so as Christians, we have a particular responsibility and a particular relationship with the Jewish people that behooves us to act when we see anti-Semitism. And so there has to be a solidarity between Christians and Jews. We have been grafted on to the tree of Israel, and we have that responsibility, and we must take it very seriously.
Good and bad. What was the pushback? What was the response?
So we wanted to, again, couch this very much in terms of the religious relationship between Jews and Christians, theological relationship. The goal was, how many signatories can we get by Simchat Torah? So Simchat Torah this year is, as you know, the religious anniversary of the attack. So I figured it would be a success if I could get 250 signatories in the space of a month and a half. I'd be happy with that. And when I pitched this idea to a variety of different people, both Christians and Jews, they said, well, Andrew, if you can get 250, that's, given the current situation, that's pretty good. I wanted 500 by Simchat Torah. We got 720. What excites me the most about those 720 signatures is that they cover the breadth of the country, as are many, many different Christian traditions. Anglicans, we have 10 Anglican bishops that signed on. We have United Church ministers. The United Church is not exactly strong in this area, shall we say. So I was really delighted by the number of priests, pastors, bishops, ministers, and lay people, lay leaders who signed on. And also a lot of, very prominent members of the business world who are leaders in their very respective churches. I had conversations with a number of people who wanted to understand why they should be signing on. Some quibbled with the theological language, and I said, look, it's not going to be perfect.
Who didn't sign it that you wanted, that you had hoped?
I would have loved to have seen more Catholic bishops. We had 5 sign, and I would love to have seen a few more people from mainline Protestant denominations sign on. But, again, the response was very good. There are a lot of Catholic priests who signed on. There are Catholic monks and monastics and religious people in religious life. So that was good. But this is really just the starting point. And so the declaration is important, but it's the starting point. And so now there are going to be many opportunities for those who didn't hear about the declaration or those who weren't sure whether they should sign on to become involved, I think, in the broader movement that it is going to launch. So that's certainly my hope. I remember having some conversations with different Christian leaders who said, well, okay, I see that it's theological in tone, but there is the geopolitical reality. And I said, yes, of course there's. We're not denying that there's the geopolitical reality, but this is about Canadian Jews. We're speaking about Jews here in Canada and the anti-Semitism that is being faced by Jews in Canada. And one Christian leader said, well, what about Palestinian Christians? And I said, absolutely, we have to speak out in defense of Palestinian Christians who are being caught in the middle and who are suffering. And they're suffering because of Hamas, and they're suffering because of Hezbollah, in Lebanon. And so, we obviously have to speak out in defense of our brothers and sisters in Christ. But that doesn't mean we can't, at the same time, stand up for our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our fellow students, Jews in Canada who are facing very bad persecution right now. When I was reading that extensive expose that the National Post did about a month ago, and I'm hearing, my good friend, Rabbi Dan Sher, here in Ottawa say thoughts about, is it time for us to leave Canada? I mean, that is unacceptable that any Jew in Canada, let alone a rabbi, should be thinking that. I mean, that's a failure from what I can see on our part to really check this rising anti-Semitism.
You mentioned Palestinian Christians. You didn't mention Palestinian Muslims. Was there any thought to being more inclusive of that as well, and maybe even reaching out to Muslims, or you wanted to just keep this petition for the Christian world and let other people kind of deal with?
Yeah, this is fundamentally about the relationship between Christians and Jews. We do not have such a relationship with any other faith. This is a unique relationship that Christians have to the Jewish people. And right now, the need is to speak out against anti-Semitism. But I will say also that, I'm very concerned about the lack of Muslim voices in this country speaking out in defense of the Jewish community. A lot of the main Muslim organizations are very much offside on these questions, and there's a lot of silence. I'm very concerned about the sort of the track that this country is on. But then let's be very honest, there are also Islamists that have taken to the streets in this country with people that support them to openly call for the death of Jews. And that's problematic. And the Muslim community, needs to account for that. I'm sorry, but that is a major problem.
There's a big controversy now, which is there's going to be some memorial service, I'm sure you're aware, in Mississauga for Yahya Sinwar, using poppies as the symbol.
Atrocious. I mean, I'm sorry, but Yahya Sinwar was a brutal terrorist who masterminded the death of 1,200 innocent people, the kidnapping of others, rapes, and so forth.
Including Christian people who were Filipino workers and others. And
yeah, of course. And then to use the poppy, that is disgusting. The poppy is a symbol of the many men and women, including Jews, including Muslims and Christians, who have fought and died for this country. And I'm sorry, that is really taking a symbol and distorting it and using it in a very disordered fashion for a man who, I'm sorry, I just can't understand what's going through people's heads when they would even propose something like that.
And then the mayor is saying, it's fine, it's public speech, it's okay. She's not going to say anything, Carolyn Parrish. She's letting it happen. Once you lose the ability to determine what is objectively true and what is objectively false, and pluralism descends into kind of a moral relativism where any opinion is treated as valid and to be considered, rather than discarding those views that are hateful, that actively promote hatred and incitement of violence to kill people. I'm sorry. That is fundamentally unacceptable. And there are reasonable limits on freedom of expression and freedom of association in this country. And, that, for me, that is the red line, really. That's a refusal to recognize the dignity in every human being. And that if we can't do that in our society, then we're going down a very bad path. But you've opposed bubble legislation, sort of a buffer zone within which legally people who cannot protest outside faith houses or schools. And in Montreal, they had to go to the courts to get it. But in Vaughan, Ontario, it's actually legislation now. And it's been quiet in Vaughan, actually, since the bubble legislation came into effect.
And okay, so you've got a 100-meter bubble zone. Or what about at the 110th meter or the 200th meter? Take, for example, let's say you have a Jewish day school or, a synagogue that is off a main thoroughfare, okay? Take, for example, I know Rabbi Kropkin quite well at the Beit, in Vaughan. And the Beit is located on Clark, and it's quite a ways in from Bathurst Street and the other sort of arterial roads. What's to say that you wouldn't have, you have your 100-meter bubble zone. What's to say that you don't have protesters then block access, from Bathurst Street or from other streets coming towards the shul? What if they do that on Shabbat and Orthodox Jews can't even walk to the shul? They have to walk through a group of protesters that are beyond that 100-meter bubble zone. I don't see it as being a long-term solution. And I have to be very honest, too, that, right now there is a 100-meter bubble zone in place in this province around abortion clinics. And within that 100-meter zone, people are not allowed to stand quietly in prayer, such as faithful Catholics and others, against, the scourge of abortion. And I'm a devout Catholic, and I think that's unjust. Now, if someone is behaving completely, obstreperously and obnoxiously and causing a disturbance, okay, then you can arrest them on a charge of public mischief or whatever. But to say that someone can't pray, in front of an abortion clinic, I think that's problematic. And there's a very big difference between a person praying their rosary and a pro-Hamas protester yelling for the death of Jews. And so I can't, in good conscience, as a Catholic, support bubble zones.
Understood. It's tricky. What do you think is behind this 3-4 year surge of anti-Semitism, including what we're seeing now, even in Amsterdam, which was people calling it a pogrom on the eve of Kristallnacht? What do you think is happening here? Because we're talking about Canada. Why?
I think there's so many different factors. One is there's always going to be hate. And you can't legislate away hate. There's been hate since the fall, and so you can do things, though, to mitigate hatred. And I would say that in this country, we have failed in many respects to do those things that can help mitigate hatred. And how do you deal with a situation in our universities where you have a lot of woke, Marxist rhetoric about colonialism and oppression and victim and so forth that is turning, Jews into the oppressors? Everything seems to be upside down in our country right now when it comes to what is true. I can speak also about broader issues, I think, where people increasingly don't come into contact with one another as they used to. People live within the world of social media. People live within the world of various types of ideological bubbles. And I just don't think that they're kind of finding genuine human community. And when you don't have that genuine human community, you have a growing inability to recognize in someone who believes something, maybe something fundamentally different to what you believe. You find it very hard to see in that person, the image and likeness of God, and to see that person as a fellow human being. It does not mean that I can't have a relationship with someone or a friendship with someone. We can differ on a whole range of things. Obviously, as a Catholic, on theological questions, I'm going to differ with Jews profoundly about who Jesus Christ is.
And a lot of things. There's, gay rights, and then there's, as you mentioned, abortion, and there's issues that lots of people would say, well, why do we want to be bedfellows with each other if we're so different? And then, of course, there's the whole Abditil Nostra Aetate, when the Vatican in the 60s absolved Jews of the responsibility for the death of Christ. There was 2,000 years of the fact that the Jews were blamed by the Christians for the murder and blood libels, and we can go on. So there's a lot of fraught backstory that this whole petition of yours comes into play for people with long memories, right?
Yeah, of course. But I think at the core is, if you cannot see in the person in front of you another human being who has similar hopes, dreams, anxieties, worries, concerns, faces challenges in their life, similar to what you might be facing. And if you can't have a relationship with that person, then that begins, if you multiply that out 1,000 times, 10,000 times, that begins to break down communities. And so I think in our increasingly atomized world, and a world where what I say goes, and we can't point to, a common pursuit of truth, and that objective and universal truth governs our lives and governs how we relate to one another. If that is gone, then it's going to be very hard to live with one another. And I think that's unfortunately what we're seeing manifested particularly now in the rise in anti-Semitism in the country. I'll give you an example of we have a group in Ottawa called Communio. It's a group of young Christian professionals. And we run it out of Caritas, which is the think tank that I work with. They're in law, they're in medicine, they're political staffers, they're public servants. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and they're all faithful Christians. And so last December, we had a dinner with 20 of them with Shimon Fogel.
That's the CEO of Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, CIJA.
So Shimon came and joined us for this dinner, and the conversation was really around how do Christians see Jews and how do Jews see Christians? And I remember asking the 20 young Christian professionals there, how many of you have a Jewish friend? I think 2 hands went up. How many of you have ever been to a synagogue? 1 hand. How many of you have ever been to a Jewish celebration, a bar bat mitzvah, Shabbat dinner, a seder? 1 or 2 hands went up. The fact that they don't know Jews very well, that was another bit of a wake-up call for me. And I think also for Jews who don't know very many Christians or have never spoken to a Christian about their faith. So that's also behind this declaration, because we hope to eventually plant some seeds across the country with Christian and Jewish congregations coming together to get to know one another, to form friendships, to have conversations, to break bread together, challah, of course, and to have those times of getting to know one another. That's a good way to combat anti-Semitism, I think, as we come to know each other better.
So that's in the works for the petition. Next step is what? You've got the petition. What are you going to do with it? Or who gets it now?
So the goal now is we're looking at early March. We're going to bring together, at a minimum, 50 Christian leaders who were engaged by this declaration from across the country, together with 50 rabbis or chazanim or Jewish day school principals, whoever they might be, to come together and to talk about how do we find better solidarity between us, and how do Christians step up in a better, more coherent, consistent, and vocal way in defense of Jewish Canadians. And what we want to do is then, after that summit, is that each Christian leader will be paired with a Jewish leader. And for a minimum of 1 year from that point on, their 2 congregations will be in a relationship. So the young people, the youth, the young adults, the women's groups, the men's groups, the clergy will get together in a variety of ways, however they determine they want to do that.
And they'll watch Nobody Really Wants This from Netflix, which is the movie of, right? No, I'm joking. But anyway.
That's right.
You know what I'm talking about?
I've heard about it, yeah.
I want to go back quickly to the reception that you're getting from the Jewish community. What has particularly remained with you? A comment maybe that you want to share with us from the Jewish community about how this endeavor has landed?
So I've just been really amazed at the number of individual Jewish Canadians who have just reached out, have found my email address and have emailed me saying, thank you for what you're doing, and we really appreciate Christians stepping up in this way. I've had dozens of those emails, and they're real gifts. I'm very grateful for them. But I remember after October 7th, this would have been probably about this time last year, I reached out to my friend Idan Sher at Matzike Hadass in Ottawa, and I said, look, what if I was to bring to the shul for Kabbalat Shabbat, Friday evening service, a group of Catholics? And he said, that would be great. We haven't really had any Christians come, to really support us and to let us know that you're there. So I went with the auxiliary bishop Catholic Bishop of Ottawa, Cornwall, Bishop Yvon Mathieu, along with a family that's kind of my Ottawa family, the Kennedy family. A number of them came, and some other Catholics. And we went to the service, and then we went to the hall afterwards and sat down at, I think it was table 21 or something like that. Wonderful meal. And then Idan gave a really stirring talk. I mean, all of his talks are wonderfully stirring. But he spoke about this rabbi, I think, in Israel who had talked about, in the wake of October 7th, about how in Kohelet there are these, kind of things. There's a time for mourning and a time for weeping. There's a time for rejoicing. And how at this moment we can hold those two things together. And then Idan looked over in our direction and said, because of table 21, whatever our table number was. And so all the eyes in the hall sort of turned to our table. And he said, at that table is our good friend, Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, Bishop Yvon Mathieu, the auxiliary Catholic Bishop for Ottawa, Cornwall, the Kennedy family, and some other Catholics who have joined us. And we were grateful for them being here. And he said a few other words. And then, Alan, I had never seen anything like it before. It was like a 2-minute standing ovation. And then the number of people from that congregation who came over to us, many in tears, saying they didn't know that there was anyone in the Christian community who would stand with them and would come and be with them. And that was tremendously moving. And so again, as Gentiles and as Christians especially, we have to stand up. And I think the last message in the declaration was to say to Canadian Jews that we will not abandon you.
You want to read it?
Yeah, I can. I'll have to pull it up here. So the declaration concludes with these last two paragraphs. We will speak out and act peacefully for the fundamental freedoms of Canadian Jews. As Christian leaders, we will speak out and act peacefully against all who promote violence against Jews and Jewish places of worship, as well as Jewish homes, schools, community centers, places of business, or any identifiably Jewish institution. We will inspire our fellow Christians in our congregations to join with us in this endeavor. And so, we declare to you, our Jewish cousins, that in these challenging times we are with you. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with you in defense of human dignity, justice, and freedom, these cherished Canadian values. And we will turn back the tide of anti-Semitism in Canada together. As Christians, we will not simply speak, but act peacefully in support of you, our Jewish friends, in the interest of all that is just and good. We will not abandon you.
Amen.
Amen.
I needed that today, so I appreciate it, and thank you so much. Hope you'll come back.
I'd love to. Thanks very much, Ellen. It's been an honor.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, made possible in part by the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. You can check out some of the who's who on Bennett's declaration. We put the link in our show notes. Bennett says for now, his faith-based Christian think tank Cardis is funding the campaign. Our show is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Write to me and let me know what you think of this conversation. I'm at info@thecjn.ca. Thanks for listening.